Hello, I'm Fred Kempe, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and I'm in Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome you to this special edition of Atlantic Council Front Page, #AC Front Page, our premier live ideas platform for global leaders. Today, we are hosting AC Front Page as part of our signature Global Energy Forum, which we would be normally hosting in Abu Dhabi as part of Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. But we've taken the opportunity to go virtual during the pandemic. We welcome all of our viewers from around the world to this very, very special session. Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, what an immense pleasure it is to welcome our distinguished speakers. First, it is my honor to welcome His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, to the Atlantic Council. Sir, we have admired your work of contributing to a better world for so many years, and on this issue in particular. We've had the privilege to feature a statement from His Royal Highness at the Council event on reaching net zero several weeks ago, which we hosted in partnership with Net Power. But this is the first time that we've had the honor to host His Royal Highness in a virtual live discussion. On January 11th, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, announced the Terra Carta as part of the Sustainable Markets Initiative. This charter, this important charter, aims to put sustainability at the heart of the private sector. Following his initial remarks, we will hear from Bernard Looney, Chief Executive Officer of BP, and Brian Moynihan, Chairman of the Board and CEO of Bank of America, and have a joint discussion. Your Royal Highness, we are humbled to be in your company today, and we are so looking forward to your remarks regarding this fantastic initiative. This virtual global floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fred. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I really am most touched to have been invited by Fred Kempe and the Atlantic Council to join all of you at this Global Energy Forum under the patronage of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, and in partnership with the UAE Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure. Having launched the Terra Carta as part of my Sustainable Markets Initiative at the One Planet Summit in Paris last week, it is only too clear that energy systems and green energy transition are vital to achieving the sustainable future that the world so desperately needs. With such a distinguished audience focused on these issues, and with such a critical year for climate and biodiversity, I must say that I'm delighted to be speaking with you all today. Now, in recent years, we have at least made progress in forging consensus on the direction humanity must take and the critical milestones we must meet by the middle of the century. However, consensus, intention, goals, commitments, and targets are only the first steps. The next, although long overdue, must be an extraordinary practical effort to mobilize the financial resources, the technical ingenuity, and institutional innovation required to pursue them. It is this which will determine whether or not our children and grandchildren look back on a series of broken promises, or instead reflect on a tipping point at which the world shifted to a more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous trajectory. Last January, none of us could have anticipated the devastating pandemic which was about to unfold, or its horrifying impact on lives and livelihoods everywhere. Today, reflecting on all that we have endured together, it is more clear than ever that human health and planetary health are fundamentally interconnected. We've seen how a global crisis, which affects each and every one of us across all borders and boundaries, can only be addressed with unprecedented levels of ambition, and that necessity, combined with science and transformative levels of resource, can deliver action at extraordinary scale. It seems to me that an appropriate historical analogy for this kind of time-bound, transformative mobilization of practical resources is, in fact, the Marshall Plan in Europe following World War II. Nothing short of an analogous effort is needed today on a global scale to help economies and societies build forward faster and better from the pandemic, while addressing the looming climate and biodiversity crises. Better in this context must mean bringing economic value into harmony with social and environmental sustainability across public, private, and philanthropic sectors. The Terra Carta, therefore, offers the basis of a recovery plan, one that will harness the precious, irreplaceable power of nature, combined with the transformative innovation and resources of the private sector. Over the past year, through my Sustainable Markets Initiative and alongside country leader engagement, I have convened global leaders from across industries and almost every sector of the economy and challenged them to identify ways to set our planet on a fundamentally more sustainable trajectory. Of relevance to this Global Energy Forum, over the past year, I have established CEO-led task forces on oil and gas, hydrogen, sustainable transport, energy storage, aviation, forestry, carbon pricing, carbon offsets, and carbon capture, use, and storage. So in these efforts over the past year, I've been engaging with Brian Moynihan from the Bank of America and Bernard Looney from BP, who are both helpfully with us today. Together, we feel that there is now a real opportunity to convene industry leaders around the energy transition. This is especially vital, knowing that energy powers all other industries that are similarly looking to accelerate their own transitions. We have also discussed the challenges around coordinating global efforts in a way that ensures we are all pulling in the same direction. So as we consider the critical role of energy in the transition, and if you can bear it for a moment, I would just like to outline some key areas that perhaps can help us move forward. First of all, as we commit to net zero, we must expedite and communicate a rational, structured energy transition with clear roadmaps at both the industry and individual business levels. This will provide the much needed market signals to other industries that rely on energy so they can plan their own transitions. It will also help to accelerate the scale up of investment in energy technologies and infrastructure, green energy opportunities, and upskilling in support of an equitable transition. Second, we must identify targeted sustainable investment opportunities around energy systems and transition so that we can put them at the forefront of a green recovery, thus avoiding the growing risk of divestment. These energy transition investments must clearly bring benefits globally to all countries and at all socioeconomic levels. Third, while some in the industry are taking big steps forward, we must bring along those who are lagging behind. This will require enhanced global outreach, engagement, and partnerships. Energy is a major input across nearly every industry. Therefore, cross-industry efforts on energy systems are also required. Fourth, we must communicate with consumers and shareholders on the wide-ranging benefits that the sustainable transition affords, including for energy. After all, it is now entirely possible to be sustainable and profitable at the same time. In fact, ESG-aligned companies and investments are on the whole outperforming those that are not, even in the current pandemic. Consumers increasingly want to know the climate and nature impacts of the goods and services they buy, including their supply chains and energy sources. Shareholders too are seeing where the world is headed and are asking for more transparency and alignment with global climate, biodiversity, and social goals. Fifth, but I'm nearly finished, we must enhance regional and global cooperation around green and renewable energy investment and production. These efforts are not unique to one city, one country, or one region. The energy transition is a global one, and required, we must all move together. Regional and global cooperation can help bridge country-level variance. For many smaller and developing states, economies of scale can only be achieved through regional cooperation. And this must be factored in as we develop and roll out transition roadmaps and solutions. Sixth, and finally, we must explore the potential of carbon capture in the energy sectors to help buy us precious time as we make this transition. The technology is available to capture existing emissions, but it needs to be applied globally and at scale. After all, cutting our emissions alone will not address the legacy carbon in our atmosphere that has built up over decades of inaction. We need to use all the tools at our disposal if we want to see a reversal of the catastrophic damage we have caused. I must say in this regard, I was most inspired to learn recently from Fred Kempe about a company called Net Power, whose breakthrough technology, the Allen-Fetvet cycle, converts natural renewable gas into zero emissions power using carbon dioxide, whilst at the same time lowering the price of energy. This example of potentially game-changing innovation demonstrates the critical role the private sector has to play in driving the solutions to the climate and biodiversity crises. Ladies and gentlemen, a sustainable future is in fact the growth story of our time. But it is up to us to seize the opportunity it presents. As we strive to imagine the next centuries of human progress, prioritizing the fundamental rights and value of nature will enable a step change in our future of industry and future of economy approach. The coronavirus pandemic has shown us that it is indeed possible to mobilize the necessary resources and accelerate the timelines for transformative progress. It has also shown us how vital health is to human and economic well-being. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my profound hope that the Terra Carta might help us to do just that. Over the coming decade, my Sustainable Markets Initiative will report on the Terra Carta as a living document, updating it regularly to reflect the rapid pace of change and continuous progress being achieved around the world. It will also continue to bring CEOs and leaders of industry together, looking to showcase the efforts they are making for nature, people, and planet. Therefore, as we look to a brighter and more sustainable future, let us join forces and waste no more time. With the clock ticking, it really is up to us to make each day count. Thank you, Fred.
Thank you, Your Royal Highness. Your leadership is truly inspirational. The Terra Carta, the rights of nature. There's so much in your statement to digest and to talk about. And for that, I'd like to now welcome our two panelists today, Bernard Looney, Chief Executive Officer of BP, and Brian Moynihan, Chairman of the Board and CEO of Bank of America. Thank you, Brian. So I'm excited now to dive into. Hold on just a second. Let me. My notes here just fell off a little bit. Let me go to a first question here for Brian Moynihan, Chairman of the Board and CEO of Bank of America. I think we all understand that the private sector is critical in driving forward progress on solving some of society's greatest challenges, and foremost among them, climate change. In that context, why is the SMI important? What does it bring to the table? Why is Bank of America committed to the SMI? And maybe for our viewers who don't know about it, you can spell out that acronym for us. And what benefits does a private sector company like the Bank of America get from its engagement with the SMI?
Well, thanks, Fred, for having, and thank you, Your Royal Highness, for your leadership here. The SMI is a Sustainable Markets Initiatives to sort of move the acronym forward. And so implied in that is the idea that we can bring private sector solutions and cooperation among private sector companies, as His Royal Highness spoke about, to help accelerate and drive a just transition that we all need to happen. And so while a company like Bank of America has a $300 billion commitment to help drive a just transition, we are carbon neutral as a company, and many companies have those individual commitments. The idea of the SMI was to bring together groups of CEOs in various industries, and there are 20 CEO groups that will be operational by in the next few months. And those CEOs then could compare notes, they could collaborate on things and move faster. They could agree to standards by which they'd be judged in their progress. And that then would allow us to move faster along the just transition lines, and we could move individually. Things like what is a carbon offset and how many are valid and how much investment can go into them and things like that. They're very practical questions that we need to answer as a group of CEOs and a group of industries. And so just to give a sense for CEOs and others why they should get involved is, as you get in these sessions and think about the principles embedded in the Terra Carta, you listen to ideas, you learn more from your colleagues, but also you start to see areas of cooperation that you can just plain move faster. And I think His Royal Highness is urging is that we can't waste time. We've got to move faster, and we can move faster together. In the end of the day, all these CEOs believe the private sector has to lead this because we have the money, the innovation, ingenuity, and working together, we can move faster.
Much for that, Brian. Let me go back to what His Royal Highness talked about with the Terra Carta and turn to Bernard, and maybe he can talk about his reaction in general to the Terra Carta and why he engaged in the SMIs. And then Brian, maybe you can follow Bernard in that. So let me pass to you, Bernard, particularly with a focus on leadership as an energy company and the role energy and power companies can and need to play in this Terra Carta.
Well, thanks, Fred. And may I start by saying that I'm probably just one of many millions of people who, for I think over 50 years now, have been inspired by His Royal Highness, by his prescience on the environment, by his campaigning, and his deeply held desire. And as Brian said, we all feel it, to bring about change. And I also count my late mother amongst those millions. But it's an honor to share the stage with Your Royal Highness and obviously Brian. Great admiration for Brian. We have the privilege of being on the Vatican-convened Council for Inclusive Capitalism together, and Brian's everywhere. He needs to give me some advice on my capacity and my diary. He's involved in so much, so it's great to see you, Brian. The answer, Fred, why do we support the Terra Carta? The simple answer is because it's about doing the right thing, but you would push me on that, and let me expand on it a little bit. We like that the aim is to put nature, people, and the planet at the heart of global value creation. And I'd go further. I'd say we don't just like it, we actually made it our corporate purpose last year. And our corporate purpose is to reimagine energy for people and the planet. And we like the recognition that there doesn't need to be a trade-off between people, planet, and profit. We firmly believe that. We like that it recognizes that each industry and each business or investor charts their own course to a sustainable future. You know, companies that want to go green are at different stages of greening. 50 shades of green, I think Mark Carney said. We all have different challenges. We've different circumstances. We've different barriers to overcome. The commonality is that we need to change. More importantly, we want to change. But the differences require different approaches, and the Terra Carta allows for that. One more thing we also like the recognition that nature, people, and planet can be aligned, and business success can be a powerful force for good. And there's no question, I think, that private companies in the private sector in the past have been the driving force behind some, I think, fantastic progress over the decades. But some of that progress has come at a price or come at a cost. And we can do something about that. And that's what the Terra Carta is about, and what His Royal Highness's Sustainable Markets Initiative, as Brian just said, is about. We're a huge supporter of both, founding partner of the SMI. So we're pleased, Fred, to add our voice in this way to what I think is a growing movement for the change that the world needs and increasingly wants. We think it'll help us advocate for the policies that we think are important, like carbon pricing. We think it'll help us with our ambition to get to net zero by 2050. We think it'll help us make a positive difference to biodiversity where we operate. And importantly, Fred, for me, because we don't have all the answers, and Brian alluded to this, and because we'll undoubtedly make mistakes along our journey, I've no doubt that it's a great opportunity for us to learn from each other and to share ideas so that we can move more quickly. So that's a little bit about what it means to us here at BP.
So we're going to go soon into a panel discussion with Brian and Bernard. We're so lucky after His Royal Highness to have a chief executive officer of one of the leading energy and power companies in the world, and chief executive officer of one of the leading global financial institutions. And I'm going to turn back to Brian for his further reflections on the Terra Carta. But first, let me tell you how to submit questions for these two gentlemen. You can submit your questions on Twitter, in my own Twitter account, which is @FredKempe, or on the event app for the Atlantic Council Global Energy Forum. So we welcome you to send in your questions. So Brian, give us a bit more reflection on the Terra Carta and how you see Bank of America partnering with this sort of initiative.
Well, I think, the Terra Carta, and having worked with the SMI group to help draft some of the provision stuff, it is important that it is a roadmap. It is a set of principles at the start, but also has very discrete commitments that companies, enterprises, others can make to help drive the just transition as His Royal Highness spoke about. That kind of roadmap keeps us on course in the SMI and others as to what we need to do. And yet behind that, we have to have very practical steps and actually have real commitments and real activities. And so, it is a guidepost. It is comprehensive. It is a set of principles. It balances the idea that we have to deliver what we call the genius that Ann and Bernard spoke about it. We have to deliver profit for our shareholders and deliver success for society, not or. And I think it gives the guidepost and gives people the ability to see the principles apply to it, figure out what their metrics could be under them to show progress, but also as a statement of the private sector in particular, as they sign on to it, and individuals can sign, private sector companies of all sizes, but it's a statement by the private sector that we will drive this transition, which is a critical statement because it has just the sheer capacity of money and talent that the private sector can bring will make this happen. So It's a great guidepost that His Royal Highness has put together. It's a stake in the ground that lays out a comprehensive Marshall-like plan, as he said, but importantly, it leads to discrete commitments that companies and others can make.
I think, Brian, that's a really important point, the discrete commitments, which always keep us moving forward. So Bernard, what is BP's role with the SMI, and why were you happy to step up and support the Terra Carta? How does that align with BP's broader sustainability goals?
Well, I think it's very aligned, Fred, and I think one of the questions that is on a lot of people's minds is, why should a lot of people out there are wondering why should the world support companies like BP who are in this transition phase? And I think it's a really good question, and I think the Terra Carta and the SMI helps us answer it. But I've seen some criticism recently of, for example, why was BP allowed to sign up to the Terra Carta? Someone else saying that maybe we shouldn't be on the Build Back Better Council here in the United Kingdom because we are, and I quote, one of the biggest polluters. And while I understand that sentiment, Fred, obviously, and I don't really like saying something like this, but I think it misses an important point. And the point is the following: for the world to transition at the pace that it needs to transition, companies like BP must transition. And therefore, it's every bit as important, if not more important, to back and encourage and support companies who are transitioning as it is to back green companies. And of course, we need more solar companies, and we need more battery companies, we need more green companies. But as importantly, we need greening companies who have the desire to change, the skills to change, the resources that Brian talked about, and the plans to change. And companies who today maybe are not green, but who have credible plans to become green. And according to the Prince's Responsible Business Network, 45% of the FTSE in the UK are now committed to net zero. But as he said, the plans are just the beginning. And this is really hard stuff, changing from the old world to the new, better world, keeping the world going as we do that, allowing countries to develop while at the same time making the world safer. And that's what we're trying to do. And I have to say it's challenging. And, Fred, must we be held to account to deliver on those plans? Absolutely. Do I understand that some people think our plans aren't sincere? Yes. And our job is to prove that they are sincere and they are real, and we will do that. And that's why we appreciate the support of those who encourage us. And we need that same support from the financial community to invest in greening companies every bit as much as investing in green companies, so that we can stimulate that pace of change. And if we're successful commercially, there is a real hope that I think it will make it easier for others to follow. So being part of the SMI and being part of the Terra Carta allows us to have that dialogue and that debate around that stake that His Royal Highness put in the ground. And it allows us to move at the pace from different starting points that we need to do and do it better together. So that's what it means to us.
Bernard, that's such a wonderful answer. And the term greening companies, I like that term a lot. And you are right. There's this tension between where people want to get and where people are, and then how do we get through that energy transition?
Yes.
And you did talk about the financial community. So with that, let me turn back to Brian. It's been a year since the launch of the Sustainable Markets Initiative. So perhaps you can respond a little bit to what you've heard Bernard just say about the pressures on companies and perhaps sometimes unrealistic when we still need fossil fuels as much as we do as part of the energy mix. But perhaps you can talk about the update on the progress of SMI, and then how do you see that and the Terra Carta developing in the next 1, 5, 10 years, with perhaps a little bit of a reflection as well on what you just heard from Bernard?
I think the number one thing is in the case of energy producing companies like Bernard's company and his colleagues, they all believe that they're trying to make transitions happen, and some have certain commitments, others have other commitments, but they're all committing along a pace. And I think what the SMI allows us to do is for all the participants to learn from those companies what we could do to help them make that transition faster. And importantly, in the Terra Carta lays this out, and His Royal Highness spoke about it, this is not a binary question of divest, not divest, lend, not lend. It is, how do we help the greening companies make the transition, but hold them accountable for them to make progress so we can stay invested with them, we can continue to lend with them. We might bring them ideas, we might bring them structures, allow them to invest discreetly into projects and increase the pace. So that's the kind of work that goes in the SMI. So think about each of these industry groups and the overall group. Noel Quinn of HSBC leads the financial services group, and they're focused on how do we really define how we green our business over time, and not just we all are net zero committed in doing that as operating companies, but how our lending practices, our investing practices. The asset management group led by Ron O'Hanley from State Street, same question. How do they get their companies underlying to make the transition so they can stay invested with them, and how do they use their investment power as a carrot and a stick, and how does that really factor through? And then we have the operating companies that are heavily in the business, like Bernard and his colleagues, that we are trying to learn from them, to saying, what do you need us to do? What projects do you have that may not be getting financed the way you might like them, or as financial companies, or frankly, what public sector help do you need from permitting and things that could happen and help us move faster? So that's the practical work of the SMI. So what would His Royal Highness like it to achieve over 1, 5, and 10 years? I think is the ability just to have real commitments that are met, be a do effort, not a think effort. We don't need to come up with we need to come up with new ideas to make action happen, but we don't need to come up with new standards and new metrics. We just need to get going. And then ultimately to be able to prove that the collaboration of a group of companies led by the CEOs has moved faster than it would otherwise move. And when you add up all those movements, it's consistent with the Paris commitments all the societies made, and the United States is re-entering as we speak.
And yesterday, President Biden, I almost said President-elect Biden, it's now President Biden, signed his way back into the Paris Agreement as one of his 15 executive orders yesterday. From your perspective, Brian, how does the Terra Carta fit within the framework that you just outlined? And I really like the idea that this is a do effort and not a think effort. Please, how does the Terra Carta fit within this framework?
Well, it represents, the statement by a person who's been heavily dedicated to this for 40 to 50 years and has thought through it and listened to a lot of people. And that's what His Royal Highness sort of wrote down. But now it's a living document. And the idea is we have a few hundred signers on, whatever the right word would be, who have joined it. The SMI participants will have signed on, and will sign on to it as more people join. But think of it as a set of principles and a set of commitments outlined that ultimately need to be made by the companies. Not every one of them can be made by every company because they're not relevant, but it's a set of guideposts in the beginning, principles. And then secondly, if you go read parts of it, says a company will commit to scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. A company will commit to being carbon net zero. A company will commit to helping the transition. And those commitments, I think, are evidence that if people are going to join this, they better be ready to take action and make commitments happen. So it's a very philosophical document on the one hand, it's a very practical document on the other hand, and it gives us a guidepost to, as people come to the SMI, say, this is what we're trying to do, sign on and help us drive this plan.
Thank you so much for that. Bernard, why should investors support companies like BP that are in this transition, that are in greening companies? I spoke yesterday to Larry Fink of BlackRock and Khaldun Al-Mubarak of Mubadala. And obviously, particularly Khaldun Mubarak of Mubadala, they're in a country that still has a lot of fossil fuels and is going to be producing them, and we're going to be using them for many years to come. We just had a conversation with Hunter Hunt where he thinks prices are going to be incredibly volatile, between $35 and $100 over the next years. But as investors are being moved by ESG standards and by social expectations, how does BP manage that, and why should investors be with you? And some would say it might be just easier to support some small renewables companies that are bubbling up.
Well, I think it's a great question, Fred, and I think there are many parts to it. But let's start with the basics, and that's the fact that the world has a finite carbon budget. It's running out, and we get that, and that's why we're transforming our company. And you know, what we offer to our shareholders is we believe that we can offer a very stable income over the next several years. And we believe that through this transition, in the long run, we will create a lot of value for our shareholders because it aligns with what society wants and needs. Today, in many parts of the world, society needs oil and gas because it is such a huge part of the energy system, but it doesn't necessarily want oil and gas. It needs it, but it doesn't want it. And I think for us to be sustainable, we must give society what it both needs, but also what it wants. So let's ask ourselves the question, what does it want? Well, what it wants is it wants energy that has three descriptors to it. It wants energy that is affordable, it wants energy that is reliable, and it wants energy that is clean. And our strategy to transform ourselves from an international oil company into an integrated energy company is about that very simple basic point. And that is about giving customers, that can be individual customers, it can be corporates like we've done with Microsoft, with Amazon, it can be with cities. We provide this service to over 100 cities in America today. It's about providing customers with what they want: clean, reliable, affordable energy. And fossil fuels are reliable, they are affordable, and they need to become cleaner. Solar or wind are clean, they're increasingly affordable, but they're not always reliable. And that's what a company like ours does. It will knit together various sources of energy so that a customer can have a one-stop shop on what it needs, which is a hospital or a data center. And we're increasingly doing deals with these companies to give them what they want, the energy that is reliable, that's clean, and that's affordable. And we believe that's the right thing for the world because we're not just waiting for the customer to pull, we're going to change the supply as well. So we're going to work this problem from both sides so that it moves at the pace that we need to. As His Royal Highness said, this is time bound. And we believe that in doing that, we're one of the few companies that have the skills to do this, we think, and will create enormous value for our shareholders. So our job for the shareholder is oil and gas will fund that transition. It's an important part of our company for decades to come. We make no apology for that. We will make it smaller. We'll shrink that oil and gas business by 40%. We'll grow that renewables business. We'll grow our mobility business. And we will create long-term shareholder value while creating that near-term dividend that is sustainable and can be paid. So that's the offer to the shareholder. That's the offer to society and to customers. And I think it's compelling. And if I look at the response just from our own people inside the company, they want to get behind it. And that's what we're trying to do. And now the job is get on and deliver it. His Royal Highness, when I first met him, I think reminded me that, you know, I'm tired of words. And I think Brian talked about doing. Enough talk, we need to crack on and deliver. And that's what we're going to do as BP. We need to now execute on that strategy and demonstrate to all stakeholders, our employees, our shareholders and society, that it creates value for all of them. And we believe that we will do that over the coming years.
So Bernard Looney, Chief Executive Officer in BP, that was a wonderful answer and really interesting information within that in terms of how much you're going to be shrinking the fossil fuel portion of this, moving on to mobility, moving on to other businesses. That's really fascinating. I wonder, Brian Moynihan, whether you can address that same question, because you're talking to investors. Why should investors continue to support the greening companies, and how should they think about renewables? And then as part of that, how do you see yourself, and how does Bank of America see the role of oil and gas in a net zero world?
Well, let's let's remember that we, like Larry, we have a $3 trillion plus investment base in our company. And we also have the #1 research platform in the world. And as His Royal Highness spoke about earlier, that our research has shown, and the team has been working on it for a number of years, that if a company is not following ESG and not delivering both profits and purpose and delivering among the dimensions that are embedded in ESG principles, if you avoid those companies as an investor, you can avoid 90% of the bankruptcies that occurred over the last couple of decades. That holds true of US companies, European companies, and Asian companies. So if I'm an investor out there and our research platform is telling you, avoid these companies because they're not making the transition that Bernard described or other elements, that then will lead your shareholders away from you because it's provable. There are other studies that also prove there's outperformance, and in fact that is something that's proved. There's more argument about that sometimes, but the reality is there's very little argument about being able to prove the underperformance that companies aren't making progress. And it's the reason why is relatively obvious. Your customers are not going to stick with you, your employee, you're not going to get the talent, and ultimately that's going to affect your shareholder competency. So there's an investor side of this. And also we have to remember as banks over time, we're going to have to think through if a company doesn't have plans to make the transition, will they be attractive to their customers and employees and their shareholders, and therefore will they be successful? So we have to think about how we have to assess that as part of our risk management and underwriting capabilities. So as a lender, we have it. And so what the pitch we make to the companies, you can come at it as a carrot or a stick. You can come at it as it's going to be good for society and good for your brand and good for your teammates and good for your customers. Or we can come at it with a stick, which is if you don't show us a plan to make progress, it's going to be a hard time to stay with you against a group of, say, 15 companies in the industry, 14 of which have a plan and 14 of which are making progress. And you're not, the money will shift to the 14 and away from the 15th one. And so this is you can come at it either way, and you come at it as a very practical matter. This is what the investor base in the world is telling us today, where they want the money to go. That's why you're seeing ESG funds emerge. That's where you're seeing specific requests to do it. And the last point I'd make is because of technology, we can create a portfolio that does will track at index and exclude very specific stocks down to $5,000 portfolio. It doesn't, a decade ago that'd have been harder, and 2 decades ago even harder. So now the question is the principles that people want to invest by, the technology allows them to do it. And so companies can think about that as a carrot or a stick. Am I doing it for the right reason? I hope so. That'd be the right answer. But if you really want to know, you're going to lose investors, you're going to lose market share, you're going to lose, and ultimately your profits won't be there. So I think that's a very practical expectation. Now, when we look at us as an operating company, that's a different question. We are net zero already in our company in terms of how we operate. We are the largest investor. We have a $300 billion environmental commitment with one of the largest investors in renewable energy in the United States, and we keep driving that. These are things we do as a very practical matter to continue to reduce our emissions, continue to help other people reduce theirs, and ultimately, under the sort of the scope 3 type of thought process, how do we start to judge our underlying operating companies that we lend to or invest in? That's a work we're doing. But frankly, if everybody in the world, every operating company made a net zero commitment, everybody's scope 3 would take care of itself over time, because in the end of the day, if everybody gets to net zero, then we can lend to them and have a net zero portfolio. And so that's why we're looking for the underlying companies to make the same commitments we're making. So there's a very pragmatic roadmap here at Bank of America, which is net zero, create offset dollars, put those to good work to create additional capacity, lend green bonds and other investments, tax advantage investments and things like that to help drive solar and other things. And that's what we're trying to do. And as an investor, we have to bring our research principles to the task. And that's what I described earlier.
Brian, that's a wonderful, wonderful answer, and really useful for global investors to tell them that if they had been following ESG earlier, they could have avoided 90% of bankruptcies, delivering profits and purpose. Terrific answer. One more question for you, Brian, and then you mentioned scope 3. I'll then come back for Bernard. We're starting to get in some questions from audience. Can the audience, you can go to the app for this form, the Atlantic Council Global Energy Forum, and ask a question, or you can go to my Twitter feed at Fred Kempe to ask a question. So Brian, one of Terra Carta's actions was the creation of a natural capital investors alliance, targeting $10 billion in investments by 2022. How will you encourage the private sector to invest in what's known as quote unquote natural capital? And for those not familiar with the term, could you please explain what you mean when you say natural capital. What's the role of the finance community in these efforts?
Well, I think natural capital in the announcement a week or so ago of the fund. These are to invest in the preservation of forest and the right kind of agricultural practices and biodiversity in the oceans and others. And so I think there's a demand by investors and our clients saying, how can I help? And one of the tangible ways they can think about it is, forest and better agriculture products, better oceans, elimination of plastic, things like that. So natural capital is investing in those natural resources that provide natural sequestration of carbon. Yesterday, His Royal Highness and I participated with a group of forest products companies of both from growing trees to making packaging, and listening to them and the innovation they have to create packaging forest, chemistry from forest means you can have bigger forests. You can harvest them on a measurable scale, and they can be sustainable, and they can produce replacement products for oil and gas products. Like instead of plastics created for oil and gas products, you can create them through wood-related products. That's that natural capital. And I think the major initiative talked about last couple of weeks ago was a Great Green Wall across Africa. And there's a need to put up a wall to avoid the desert moving deeper into Africa. And I think His Royal Highness has created a fund of 10 billion that we all have to commit some amount of money, a little bit from everybody, who adds up to a lot, to help country by country, community by community, build a natural business plan along that several thousand mile stretch, so that you can have people make a living, you can have forestation and proper agriculture and water, and then that natural business system lends to the biodiversity being preserved and jobs being preserved, and water and other things might be better for that community. That's a tremendous challenge, and $10 billion is part of what's needed. They need $40–50 billion immediately to do it. So, countries and others will have to make commitments, but it's a major step. But the idea of preserving that natural sequestration capability and doing it the right way will help the overall emissions position of the world.
Thank you so much, Brian. Bernard, this one comes from our audience. It comes from S&P Platts, Chris Midgley. And the question is, Repsol committed to be net zero, including scope 3. Who should be responsible for scope 3, consumers or industry? And what is BP's plan to include scope 3? And also, because not all of our audience viewers know what scope 3 is, perhaps you can start by telling them that.
Very good. Well, thank you, Chris, for the question, and it's a great one. And I want to clarify where we are on this, because it is, I think, a unique part of the commitment, the net zero commitment that we have made, and I think a very positive one. Scope 3 emissions are basically what happens to the carbon, what happens when the carbon is emitted from your product when it is burned. So we may sell it at a gas station, and the question is, scope 3 emissions are when the gasoline is put in the car and the gasoline is combusted. Scope 1 and scope 2 is what emissions are involved in getting the oil or the petrol, the gasoline to that point. So it's really about the combusted product. It's the vast majority of the emissions in hydrocarbons. What we said on February the 12th, when we laid out our net zero ambition, was the following. Every year, BP produces somewhere between 2–2.5 million barrels a day of oil and gas. That's the oil and gas that we are uniquely digging out of the ground, and we may not sell it all to a customer, but that's what BP is involved in adding to the system. When that product is burned, that 2–2.5 million barrels a day of oil and gas is burned, it releases over 400 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent each year. We said we will take that to net zero. This is a hugely important step, because what matters, what happens when the oil and gas is combusted. That's where the real emissions come. And we've said, if we take what we enter into the atmosphere and assume it's combusted, which it is somewhere along the chain, not always by us, but by somebody, we will take that to net zero. And I think this is what's really important. It's about absolute emissions reduction. It's about taking that number of 415 and taking it to net zero. So we think it's a hugely important part of what the world needs. The world needs absolute emissions to fall. We also have an intensity metric, but we're really focused on the absolute emissions. And if everyone took their absolute emissions to net zero, as Brian said, it would be problem solved. Not easy, of course, but that's what we've set out to do. And we've set interim targets now by 2030, where we say that number will be around 35% reduction. So we're all over this. We absolutely acknowledge scope 3. We've defined it as what we add to the system, and it's the combusted product that is that 415 million tons, and we will take that to net zero. And that is what I believe the world needs.
Thank you so much for that. So we're lucky enough to be able to go back to His Royal Highness in 2 minutes. Let me ask a final question for each of you, and keep your answers short, and then we'll go back to His Royal Highness to close this session for us with his observations on what he's heard. We've talked a lot about the power of partnerships and SMI, Terra Carta, a great example of that. Talk to us briefly about why do partnerships matter for addressing climate change, perhaps with one example of what demonstrates that. And maybe we could go first to Brian and then Bernard and then to His Royal Highness. I'll turn to him after that.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for hosting us, and thank you to Bernard, and thank you to His Royal Highness for his leadership here. It's been an honor to be the chair of the SMI here. And just to give you, I'm going to give you a very practical question. We had a aviation group meet, and we talked about sustainable aviation fuels. And because we had people in that room that heard what people were doing, and they actually had installations and it worked, and they were building facilities, we could have other people commit to buy that fuel. And we're trying to work to get another facility built inside the United States to deliver sustainable aviation fuel. So that happened because of the interface between people who knew the sustainable aviation fuel market and people who use aviation fuel in their fleets and others. Those types of solutions are really in the collaboration. And that's a very minor one, and there's major ones, but that just goes to show you that if you get a group of people in a room who have a common purpose, they'll find a way to accelerate or change something faster than they'd otherwise done. And that is the SMI. So for those people out there listening, we'd like to join the SMI. We'd like you to sign on to the Terra Carta principles and become a member and help us move faster as a collaborative group.
Thank you, Brian. Bernard.
Fred, well, I don't want to get in the way of His Royal Highness, but just a couple of things from me on partnerships. Just very quickly, the first thing I would say is no one has all the answers. BP certainly doesn't. We got a lot of experience, 112 years of experience, but I can tell you, we don't have all the answers, and we can all learn. And my mother used to tell me that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them in that proportion. And that means listening and learning, and partnerships help us do that. And the second, I'm always reminded of the question, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? And clearly in the matter of climate, and I would argue anything that's important in the world, we want to be effective. And we shouldn't be sitting here arguing about our position. We shouldn't care about whose idea it was that helped us solve some problem. All we should care about is that we get a solution, that we're effective. And that's what partnerships do. As Brian said, they bring people together with a common goal, with different life experiences, and with the power of diversity, we can solve problems. And we're doing that with cities today, Fred. We've partnered with Aberdeen and Houston to help them get to net zero. We've got the same in Reliance and Geo in India. We're doing it with Microsoft. We're helping Uber in London. They have 45,000 drivers. They want to be net zero. They want to be electrified by 2025. We're helping them do that. The list goes on. So partnerships are in our DNA. The SMI is a great example of it under Brian's fantastic leadership. And you know, we're all in on partnerships, so to speak. I think the world needs more, not less in this space. So with that, back to you, and thanks for having me on.
Thanks to both of you, and I just love those specific cases. I love case studies of partnerships so people really see how it works. Your Royal Highness, you kicked off a magnificent discussion. We turn back to you if you would like to provide a response to Brian and Bernard's comments or for any final remarks of your own.
Thank you very much, Fred. If I can just say, I'm enormously grateful to Brian and Bernard for making all the absolutely critical points that were needed to be made. But if I may say so also, I hardly dare say really, but I've spent, I suppose, very nearly 40 years of my life, amongst other things, on trying to encourage corporate social environmental responsibility. And during a large proportion of all those years, it has been what could only describe as an uphill struggle to get a great deal of engagement. And only now, suddenly, has the dam burst. And I now find myself being approached by all sorts of people wanting to work with us on these absolutely crucial matters we've been discussing. So for me, the private sector is a major part of the solution that we need. And the energy sector is the solution when you think about it. So there really is no time left to wait, I feel, for the public sector. If the private sector leads in the right direction, following the most beneficial principles for nature, people, and planet, and thus, of course, for our own economy, and recognizing the increasing power of consumers, and above all, the younger generation to help drive the transition we need, let alone the increasing concerns of shareholders in all this, and that is another factor that's becoming increasingly plain, then the public sector will follow. Only with the private sector recognizing its responsibility to ensure that each sector in our human economy is in harmony with nature's own economy. That's only then can we make the progress we need. And it is because, when you think about it, we have forgotten the order of nature and the limits it inevitably imposes on us, that we have engineered the catastrophic damage and disruption we are now seeing. And it must tackle without further delay all these particular issues. We have failed consistently to address the hugely negative externalities of our exploitative economic model. And as BP is now beginning to demonstrate under Bernard Looney's leadership, fossil fuel companies can become a major part of the solution we need by transforming themselves into, as he said, integrated energy companies, investing rapidly in renewable and innovative alternatives. To have an equitable transition, this is surely the only way, but it has to be done in a transparent way and as rapidly as possible. Otherwise, we will have failed the future of everything. So I can only ask you, as Brian mentioned, to engage with my Sustainable Markets Initiative, and through that with Terracotta. By engaging, we will be able to build, hopefully, the kind of beneficial, innovative global alliance of the energy sector, which then simply cannot be ignored by the public sector, and which could then lead to an even bigger private, public, and civil society partnership that I feel is so long overdue. Thank you, Fred.
Your Royal Highness, that was just the most fitting close I can imagine to such a rich discussion. Your quote, "Only now has the dam burst," and it has burst indeed with the public sector coming along. You see now with former Secretary of State John Kerry now being the special envoy for President Biden. Your 40 years of work, Your Royal Highness, are greatly appreciated and are now paying off, I think, in a significant way. Thanks to Brian and Bernard for their remarkable contributions. You cannot hear the global round of applause, but that's what's happening right now. And as it takes place, I'm going to pass my seat to Randy Bell, the director of our Global Energy Center, to move us on to the next part of our program. Thank you, gentlemen.
Good morning, everybody. Very good to see you again. Thank you all so much for joining us for our panel on accelerating the hydrogen economy. I hope you all caught the last panel with His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, Bernard Looney, and Brian Moynihan. Really remarkable. And I think His Royal Highness's remarks at the very end saying that we've reached a moment where the dam has burst on climate action, on taking responsibility for the environment is really fitting, and I think leads us well right into our next panel, because I think we all know that for hydrogen, the dam has burst, and that from being a technology that was talked about but seen as niche, that never quite took off, despite a number of opportunities, we're now in a position where hydrogen seems to be the hot topic for 2021. I want to first go to a slide from our global energy agenda, the publication we launched just on Tuesday. You'll see right here, we asked our survey respondents in our global energy agenda survey, which of these energy technologies will see the greatest percentage increase in investment in 2021. And by far, hydrogen was the highest. So people think that hydrogen will get more investment than battery storage, solar, wind, grid modernization, et cetera. Increase in investment, I should be clear. And that was 31.3% of our respondents thought hydrogen. I think that says something about what we're going to see in 2021. And I'd like to welcome our panelists now. So